Dear learners, welcome back to this course on women and law in India. Hope you all are doing well. So, we started our discussion with the developments that took place in the colonial past. It means we were actually traveling in the history. And today we are going to continue our discussion. Rather, we'll take it forward. And today we will be discussing the legislations, women and the legislations during colonial India. In the last session, we discussed the issue of codification. We discussed the major developments that took place in 18th century. And now we will be moving forward and we will be entering into the 19th century. 19th century is something very important because social reform movements took place in 19th century. And along with it started with the social reform movements, and then we entered into this long phase of the national movement, the movement for our independence. And you know it that there also we had non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement, and finally we had Quit India. So we will start with the beginning of the 19th century. When we try to understand the social reform movement, we all know this very well, that the objective of the social reform movement was the removal of social evils, because this was identified, this was very well admitted that there were a number of social evils prevalent in the society at that time. And most of these evils revolve around women. If you take the case of sati, or if you go into the details of the deplorable condition of widows at that time, or if you take the case of child marriage, denial of education for women, the parda system that was there, and a number of other such issues. So when East India Company, it established its authority, it established itself as a colonial enterprise. So what did it need? It needed justification for the colonial rule. This justification was something which was very important for them. So what did British do? They used these social evils as the pretext to prove the barbarity and degeneration, the depravity of the colonized culture. So in order to prove this point that the colonized society, the Indian society, the indigenous society, it is cruel to their women, it is full of a number of the customs, the practices which are not civilized, quote unquote. So they use this pretext, was used by them, and this is how they tried to justify their rule, that the society, the colonized society, was in the need of this civilizing mission. So this was one thing. Another important development was the emergence of this educated, English educated intelligentsia in the form of reformers. So there were these were the male social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar, and many others who joined this team of reformers, and these were the people who took up the cause of women's issues, and these were not seen as women's issues, rather were seen as more as the issues in the society, more as the social evils. So we had seen that during 19th century, women were converted as a site of reform. So from the objects of oppression, they were treated as the site of reform. And later on, there was this another important development in the form of nationalist, and Tanika Sarkar calls it, has given this term nationalist revivalist. So the nationalist revivalist response to this condemnation of social customs, which was done by the British, it was so what was the reform? The reform was what was the response? The response was this, that how can we bring reforms within the inner sphere? So this inner sphere and the outer sphere, the dichotomy between the two, the distinction between the two is important to understand. And Partha Chatterjee's framework becomes important when we try to understand this alignment. Outer sphere or the material sphere, we can also call it the public sphere, the public domain. It represented the superiority of the colonizers. We have the colonizers and we had the colonized, because we know that the colonial rule was there. British as the imperial power, they established their control, their governance, and we had seen that how law was used as an instrument to establish their governance and to strengthen their governance. So what had happened here? That colonizers were already there in the public sphere, okay, and they established their superiority, their authority in different fields, in the field of science, technology, economy, modern methods of statecraft. So these were the arenas where they had their supremacy, the British, the colonizers. Now, what was left? So it was the inner space, the private domain, which was left to the colonized people. And because when it comes to the public sphere, when it comes to the material world, the colonized, the Indians had to work hard to challenge the domination, because the domination was already there. Whereas home represented the inner self, the other side, the private domain. And this was the independent space representing the true self, the inner self. And East, when we see this dichotomy in terms of the West and East, so East had this spiritual superiority, and thus the emphasis was on this idea that the spiritual superiority had to be retained. If the adaptations are required, if some kind of reform is required, then the reform needs to be initiated. This acknowledgement was there, but not at the cost of losing the true identity. So the true identity had to be there, had to be saved rather. And without compromising this spiritual distinctiveness of the inner sphere, the reforms can be initiated, and the reforms were initiated. So this idea was there and this idea was prevalent. Partha Chatterjee makes this argument that along with this, this entire discourse which revolved around the dichotomy between the outer and the inner world, which we can call it as ghar and bahar. Okay, or bahar because outer is the bahar, and then we have ghar, the inner sphere. Now, this concept of new patriarchy is something very important, where this image of new woman evolved. And who was this new woman? What was special with this new woman is important to understand, because this is telling us, through this conceptual framework, we are trying to understand the developments happening during 19th century. So Partha Chatterjee argued that Indian patriarchy was recast, and it was a kind of new patriarchy which came into play, offering women new responsibilities. There was this change in the image of women. So if you will find the visuals, if you'll go to the visuals, if you'll, you take any book and which has a chapter on 19th century, so you will find the idea of conjugality being present, companionship in marriage. So this conjugality or conjugal love was not there earlier, but we see that Victorian ideals penetrating and creating a space in the Indian social fabric of that time. So this new women is having new set of responsibilities within families and obviously also in community and towards nation as well. We also find this call made by Gandhiji for women to join the national movement, which is happening, which has happened after the passage of some time, where Gandhiji has invoked this ideal of Ram Rajya, that nation is now in danger. So women had they had to come out, and they had to come out in the public sphere and join the movement. So we see how these imageries, how the ideals were being invoked, and different ideals, and how women acquired new set of responsibilities. And not only responsibilities, they also got opportunities. So one significant opportunity was education. They got opportunities for education, and this paved way for newer set of horizons. This led to the establishment of women's organizations in 19th century and then in 20th century also, because earlier the entire campaign started with male social reformers taking up the cause of women's question, because this women's question is very important. We find that a number of issues revolved around women's question, and then later we see that women themselves raising their issues. They started forming their own organizations. So we got Women's Indian Association, WIA. Then we also had NCWI. We also got AIWC, All India Women's Conference. Bharat Stree Mahamandal was there. So we had a series of women's organizations. So coming back to what Chatterjee had to say, that this new woman was created, and the new woman was educated, a middle class educated woman, And this woman or the new women were seen as the bearers of Indian tradition. Coming back to this inner sphere, that some adaptations were made, but what had happened, that these women were seen as bearers of nation. And this was not the case of 19th century only. We can still find the resonance of this idea, where women are seen as symbolic bearers of the family honor, honor of the community, honor of the family, or the identity of the nation, or honor of the nation. You must have gone through a number of case studies where violence against women had taken place. It took place in cases, of rights, be it communal rights, be it war, or you can take the case of partition of India, where women bore the brunt of the partition, because you see that the kind of the violence, the kind of the atrocities and brutalities committed against women on both the sides of the border, it was unprecedented. The pattern of violence, be it the intensity, be it the pattern, or be it the gravity, you will find it is unparalleled. Okay, so I hope that this is understandable, that how women became the bearers of the nation's identity, of Indian traditions, the spiritual ones. They were seen as the bearers of the spirituality and the uncolonized ones, because the outer sphere was something where the domination was already there. So it was the inner sphere which was independent of that domination. So through this entire framework, the nationalists established their hegemony over the inner spheres. Inner sphere was still, in control, in governance of the colonized people, colonized men. So this is the idea formulated by Arthur Chatterjee. And then, this led to this idea led to the need for legislative intervention, because reforms were required. This idea was accepted that, okay, to some extent, but then there were debates as well. For example, when we'll discuss age of consent, then you will find the kind of the controversy, the debates that were there on the issue of raising the age of consent from 10 to 12. And then for when it comes to Child Marriage Restraint Act, then the age was again increased. So this is something very important to understand, that how, and consent for what? Consent for the consummation of marriage, for this legal definition of the consummation of marriage. So there were a number of areas when we talk about the areas in which the legislative interventions are seen by the colonial administration. So we see that the colonial discourse based itself on the critique of Indian traditions, because this critique justified their rule and it provided the space for accommodating the civilizing mission. While there were other issues also, such as the widow remarriage, female infanticide, education, child marriage, etc. This issue of sati, the most clinching example was the practice of widow immolation, or which is also known as sati, which held both fascination and horror among colonial rulers. because they seeing the practice of a woman being burned alive on the pyre of the deceased husband was something where you'll find a lot have been written by the travelers, by the officials, and in different ways by the magistrates who were there at that time. Sense of uncomfort, horror, and a strange sense of fascination was also there. When it comes to sati, because today we will be discussing about sati, this abolition of sati, and then the civilizing mission. So initially they did not intervene. The British did not legislate. There was refusal to legislate against sati because they were fearful of the social revolt. An early compromise was made, and this compromise was in form of making a distinction between good sati and bad sati. So what is good here? Good means that scriptures have sanctioned this practice. So good means that scripturally sanctioned, and bad where there are certain conditions. So there had been a case, and in 1805, where the acting magistrate of Bihar, Elphinstone, intervened against the burning of an intoxicated 12-year-old widow. And in this case, because you know that earlier, what was the practice, that Pandits and Qazis were there in the courts, colonial courts, and they were asked to give their viewpoints, their commentaries. So Pandit Ghanshyam Surmono declared that widow immolation had scriptural sanction. However, he specified that under certain conditions it was prohibited. And what were these conditions? In case of pregnancy, 1, if the widow was intoxicated, or third, if she was coerced, if she was forced to do this, or if the widow was less than 16 years of age. So this was the initial arrangement that was made. Then comes a number of circulars, 1813, 1815, 1822. In different years, circulars were issued, and these circulars specified different conditions. For example, the difference between Anumarna and Sehmarna. Anumarna means burning of the widow with the body of the deceased husband, and it was for Brahmins. And for non-Brahmins, it was the burning along with any article that was being used by the deceased husband. So these were considered as the acceptable practices. Then we have this 1822 circular, which is important because which specified the need of proper record keeping of widow immolation, mentioning the name, age, caste, occupation of the husband. So you find that later on, what had happened, that a number of people have gone back to these records. For example, scholars like Anand Yang, Lata Mani, who have done extensive research, and they have brought out different formulations on the issue of sati. So Anand Yang, for example, noted that the practice of sati was prevalent among specific communities. And it was most of the time high caste communities where the practice was prevalent, was the dominant practice. It was there as dominant practice. However, what had happened, that the extraordinary attention that was paid to the practice by the colonial rulers, sometimes it did the reverse. It actually encouraged the practice even in communities where it was not the dominant one dominant norm earlier. So we need to understand the intricacies, the nuances within the practice of widow immolation. Another very important pattern is the invocation of the selective use of scriptures, because, and this is something very important to understand, that people, because, Raja Ram Mohan Roy is known as the father of modern India, and who led this campaign to legislate against sati. And earlier, Ram Mohan Roy had written this Persian work, is very famous, which is known as Tuhfatul Muvahhideen, where he gave a lot of emphasis on reason, on the significance of reason and rationality. But it is interesting to note that how, when he led this campaign, he did not invoke reason. Rather, he invoked traditions. He invoked shastras to get the support from people for the legislation banning sati. So, and then this is something very important to understand, that both the opponents and the supporters of the campaign invoke traditions in their different ways, in their own ways. So it was the selective use of the scriptures, and there was a lot of debate on what tradition has to offer, what did tradition emphasize, what did shastras emphasize. For example, when Pandit Ghanshyam Sarvano gave this distinction between the good and bad sati, so on the basis of shastras only the distinction was provided. One can quote Lata Mani, because Lata Mani, what she says, that tradition was thus not the ground on which the status of women was being contested. Women, in fact, became the site on which tradition was debated and transformed. So the emphasis was on this idea whether tradition favored the practice or whether tradition opposed the practice. And finally, we saw that we got this legislation, this ban, legislative intervention actually had happened in 1829, and during the time of William Bentinck, when it was the prohibition was finally there. So, and this was the first such intervention, major intervention. And then after sati, we had this Hindu Widow Remarriage Act 1856. And in 1857, we had the revolt, the first war of independence. So, before 1857, we need to understand the two major legislative interventions made by the colonial officials, and not by themselves, rather at the behest of, at the demand of the community. Because you know it well, and in 1857 this was again proclaimed that the rulers will not interfere, this policy of non-interference in the personal matters of the natives, the indigenous people. So the demand has to come from the community itself. So in case of widow remarriage also, what do we see? That Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar, again we find that another social reformer who led the campaign, and then finally the act was passed in 1856, But what was the impact of this act and how did it influence women at that time? So we had a number of people who worked in this area. For example, Lucy Carroll did extensive research on case laws, on judicial decisions of Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, and then Allahabad High Court. So these four high courts and their decisions on the issue of widow remarriage, and then after remarriage, what about the widow's right to retain the property of the deceased husband or the first husband? Will she be able to continue to have that right, to exercise that right, or is it still there, or is the right not there? So we will go into the details of Widow Remarriage Act, what had happened prior to the passage of the act, and what had happened, what was the impact of this act, how did it actually benefit women at that time. This needs to be understood in detail, which we will continue in the next discussion. So I hope you understood this entire public discourse that was there during 19th century, and then the campaign for legislation against sati, and then how did it penetrate, what was its influence in the society at large. Thank you so much. We'll meet again. Thank you.